going to start our Story in Scripture 6-week series. And let me just give some introduction about what the premise of that's going to be. So we're going to basically walk from Genesis through Revelation in 6 sections. And those 6 sections are a very, 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 very digested version of what the Gospel Project does. And basically, it's supposed to get you ready for the Gospel Project and also kind of get people up to speed. Because when we start in the fall with Gospel Project, because of the way the sequence flows, we will be about half a year to a year behind the beginning of Genesis. It'll sort of depend also on just what kind of modifications we had to do because of the quarantine. So we'll probably jump in about, I think it's going to be around Deuteronomy, I think is where we'll be, somewhere in the time of the life of Moses, I think, if the schedule is what I think it is. So this lesson and next week's lesson is sort of going to be sort of the entry point for all the adults, since we'll be sort of jumping in sort of already started because of the cycle, and then have to finish up Genesis through Numbers or whatever we have to start with at the end of the 3-year cycle for us. So it'll be really interesting as well. So again, I will cover materials that we'll cover again, but for some of them, we will not see them for a couple of months, if not a few more years before we get there. All right, so with that, let's jump into Genesis. So today's lesson is going to be on the book of Genesis, and there's a reason why Genesis gets its own lesson. So much of the Bible hinges on our understanding of how Genesis works. Genesis, of course, comes from the Greek word which means beginnings, and it tells us a lot about the beginnings of several different themes or issues that we're going to see throughout the collection of scriptures as well. So we, of course, start with the beginning of the world, the beginning of humanity. We have the beginning of sin. We have the beginning of Israel and other nations. And we also have the beginning of the covenant. And so we'll be talking about those in sort of different ways and try to keep it, again, about no more than 30 minutes in total length. Okay, so the book of Genesis can be divided into 3 main sections. The first section is called the primeval history, or the primordial history, depending on who is writing it. And that's Genesis chapter 1 through 11. Okay? We'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. Then the second section is Genesis 12 through about 35, and I'll discuss that why it's a little fuzzy there at the end when we get there. And that's called the patriarchal history. Patriarchal history. And then finally, we have from about chapter 35 to the end, chapter 50, what's called the story of Joseph, which is the third section of Genesis. Okay? So we can think of Genesis as 3 different books in that way. So it has 3 sort of complete units that sort of weave together. The primeval history, which starts with creation and takes us to just before the call of Abraham, leads into the call of Abraham, and that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the 3 patriarchs that form the patriarchal history. And then Jacob has several sons, of which one is Joseph, which gives us that third section. So Genesis as a whole connects all together from the creation of the world until the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Israel and their families, go down to Egypt at the end of the book of Genesis. But like I said, we can also see Genesis as 3 different books or 3 different units that have their own stories. And so that's going to be one of the things we're going to sort of focus in on. Okay, so in section 1, the primeval history, we get the beginning of all these different things. So the beginning of the world in Genesis 1 and part of 2, the beginning of humanity, with also sort of the end of chapter 1 and chapter 2, and we'll come back and deal with that in just a second. The beginning of sin, which is in Genesis 3. And then we have the beginning of the nations, so the different people groups and tribes and families that sort of comprise the rest of Genesis about 5 through 11. In the time of those families, in Genesis 6 through 9, we're going to have the flood, which sort of restarts the world as well, and again begins to tell us how covenant begins as well. So we're going to have the beginning of covenant with Noah. Now, so coming back again, starting to again go through a little bit slower now. So in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, we have two renditions of the creation of the world. Now, this is not the only types of creation narratives that we have in Scripture, but these are the two most famous ones. So Genesis 1 is structured around 7 days. So the seventh, which is the reason why we think that the week has 7 days in it, because there are 7 days of creation. Now, those 7 days of creation are built in two sets of three. So I'm going to try to, since I don't have a whiteboard behind me, I'm going to try to use my hands. Okay, so you have Genesis chapter day 1, 2, and 3, and then 4, 5, and 6 form two sets of three. Okay, so day 1 and day 4 are the sort of beginnings of the heavens, the earth, and the sun and the moon. And the days 2 and 3 deal mainly with the plants and the land and things, sort of the formation of the land and the water, and then sort of the plants on day 5. And then days 3 and 6 sort of have this idea of the filling up of the land with animal kind. So we get sort of the idea of filling in day 3, and then we get all the different animals of the air and the water, and then finally humans in day 6. And again, we'll go back and talk about it a little bit more when we get to that part in the Gospel Project, and as well as other things. Now that 7th day, remember we have day 1, 2, and 3, day 4, 5, and 6, and then we have sort of the day 7 sort of is the last unit, and on that day we are of course told that God rests, which is why the 7th day is holy in Scripture, and this leads us to a discussion of why we as Christians don't necessarily have our church services on Saturday, the 7th day, and instead we have them on Sunday, the 1st day. Now, that has to do with, of course, what we just celebrated yesterday, Easter. So if you remember from what we discussed as well with our Good Friday and Easter services, the crucifixion of Jesus and his death is on Friday. And then they put his body into the ground just before sunset. And of course, since it's just before sunset, it's almost the Sabbath, and they can't do anything else with him. They have to rest, as according to Jewish law, commemorating that 7th day when God also rested. And so when the women come back on the morning of Sunday is when they see that Jesus has been raised from the dead. And that's why Christians celebrate their holy day on Sunday, while Jews, even today, celebrate their holy day on the 7th day, or the Sabbath. Okay, so that's just, again, connecting to where we kind of get that idea as well. There's some other things we'll learn about through Gospel Project about how Sabbath works and the different connections to the 7th day as well. But Genesis 1 sort of gives us the first template about why we have this idea of a day of rest. All right, so again, in Genesis 1, everything is very structured, right? We have these days and things happen, and then the next day, the next sort of thing happens as well. When we get to Genesis 2, it gets all sort of mixed together. Right, Genesis 2 is less concerned with its description of creation about the orderliness of creation, as well as, instead of being more, Genesis 2 is more concerned with the intention of creation. Right, so in Genesis 2, we see God much more actively involved in the process of creation. Right, so in Genesis 1, we get what's called fiat creation. He sort of says something and it happens, and then he says it's good. But God is sort of a very distant figure in Genesis 1. In Genesis 2, God literally gets his hands dirty, right? He gets into the dust of the land and forms humans out of the soil, and then breathes into them the breath of life that gives them their humanity, we learn. Now, it's not told exactly what that constitutes in humans that separates us from other animals or from plants or from fungus that we know now. But we do see that because God has this intention of making humankind, that intention is what brings about his caretaker, which are the humans. Right, so again, if you look at Genesis 1 and 2 together, we have similar events, not necessarily in the same order, and that's because the two chapters should be thought of as sort of parentheses around the idea of creation. We have on one hand that God is very orderly, and he sort of establishes it by his will, and on the other hand, we have that creation is intentional, that God is involved in the process intimately and personally. All right, so that is both the setup for what we see in Genesis 3. In Genesis 3, we see the sin that enters the garden, right? So God at the end of chapter 2 gives both Adam and Eve a command. They can eat of any fruit of the tree of the garden except for one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve, because of the deception of the serpent, but also because of their own, I'm going to leave it blank here for a second, go out, take the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and eat it, and then have awareness of the good and evil. They understand that they have sinned and violated God's commands, and that he is displeased with them. And the Bible describes that as that they realize that they are naked and they are ashamed. Now, I'm going to come back to that sort of blank I left there for what they did, right? This is a concern that we're not going to get answered in Genesis, but also, frankly, never in any of the Bible. We don't exactly know whether the sin that they committed is before or after they eat the fruit, right? So there's a lot of discussion in systematic theology and in church history about exactly when it is that they sinned. Did they sin because they wanted to eat the fruit, or did they sin because they had eaten the fruit, right? So if and this comes up in a lot of different places. It also comes up in our daily life when we think about the difference between temptation and sin. And really, this is again why we need to read and understand the book of Genesis, because that tension between what is temptation and what is sin is going to be a theme that we're going to see throughout the scripture. And it's not going to ever be definitively answered for us, because it really does depend on the person and the sin. But there in Genesis 3, we see the beginning of the sin nature, the idea that we have become separated from God by our own intentional choices, and that separation is manifested in Genesis by a physical separation of humans from God in the garden, right? He has to cast them out of the garden, and from that moment on, humans are physically and spiritually separated from the presence of God. All right, so in chapter 4, we continue this theme of the entry of sin, right? So Adam and Eve really messed up. They eat this fruit they're not supposed to, and they go out and they have two sons, Abel and Cain. And Abel and Cain have very different lifestyles, and there's a lot of discussion we can do about that. I'm trying to keep my time down here. I have the whole 2 other sections of Genesis we have to get through. But again, if you're not familiar with this story, Cain kills Abel because of jealousy. Abel is favored by God, and Cain is unfavored by God. And so Cain kills his brother. And with that, we have now not only just we have sin, we also have violence and murder. And of course, at this point, we see a second separation. So in Genesis 3, we see the separation of humanity from God. And in Genesis 4, we see the separation of humans from other humans, right? We see the entry of violence, of deception, and of murder. And again, this sets up a course that we're going to see, the course of history that we're going to see for the remaining chapters of this primeval history, right? So we're going to see sort of 2 types of humans start to emerge. The humans that are righteous like Abel, and the humans that are unrighteous like Cain, and they are going to be at odds and have disagreements and violence to each other throughout the remaining chapters. And that's going to lead up in chapter 6 to the time in which God looks down upon all the humans, and there's so much violence and so much unrighteousness that he chooses to judge the world and kill off all of the humans who are there, with the exception of Noah and his family. And, so again, we can go back and talk about the flood. That takes up 3 chapters within the book of Genesis. At the end of that, we thought we may have gotten free of the sin, but no. At the very end of the primeval history, Noah and his family are rescued from the waters in the ark, and they land on the solid ground after the water has dissipated. And again, sin re-enters the world as Noah's own son and grandson seemingly betray him and cause him to sin against them. And so again, we see that even though that God has judged the world, sin has not been purified from the earth. It has only been contained by God's judgment. And again, that's another theme that we can see connected to what we just learned about or experienced in Good Friday and Easter, the idea that we as humans cannot atone for our own sin. We cannot reach to God through our righteousness. God has to enter into our world, take upon himself in the form of Jesus, our humanity and our punishment so that we can be restored to God. All right, so that's the first unit, the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11. Our second unit is the patriarchal history. And the patriarchal history, we have 3 people, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a grandfather, a father, and a son. And of course, they're called the patriarchs because they have the origins of the nation of Israel in that. So again, we come out to this big, broad sphere of the world and all of humanity, and then we come down sort of through one family to Noah. And now we're going to take it even further down into one specific family, the family of Abraham and Sarai, and then Isaac and Rebekah, and then Jacob and Rachel and Leah, right? So we have this one kind of family drama that we're going to follow in the middle section of Genesis. Okay. So again, to kind of summarize it, there's a lot in there with the patriarchs. Much of the patriarchal history is based around this idea of covenant. So let me start there. So covenant is the idea of an agreement between 2 agents, between 2 persons who can form an agreement. And we have covenant all the time in our legal sphere here in the modern world. We would call it a contract, right? So in a contract, you have 2 groups of people or 2 people who form an agreement about a certain thing, and there are conditions and there are expectations, and there are even perhaps punishments in the forms of having to be paid if you fail to keep up your end of the bargain. Now, a covenant is a little bit more advanced or even intense than a contract, because a covenant usually involves, as one of the punishments, death. So the idea of covenant is that you will die if you do not keep your end of the covenant. And so that becomes a major theme that we're going to see in the patriarchal narrative. It's the idea of that Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob cannot keep their end of the bargain. In fact, they repeatedly fail to even do the simple things that God asked them to do. And in fact, that narrative of sort of deception and of failure is actually what helps us to understand how God approaches covenant. So from the beginning, when God makes a covenant with Abraham, that covenant is always one-sided. God is the one who is making the covenant, and God is the one who is going to ultimately keep the covenant. And again, that is the other side. So while Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are failing to keep the covenant, God is constant in his maintenance of the covenant, right? So, and that's what we get when Isaac inherits the property and the servants and the wealth from Abraham. God renews the covenant with Isaac. And when Jacob inherits all of the stuff from Isaac, God renews the covenant with him. Now, within that, we also see the idea of other people who are associated with covenant but do not fully enact or receive its blessings, right? So Abraham has 2 main sons, Ishmael and Isaac. but Isaac is the one who gets the covenant. And Ishmael is sent off. He's very wealthy and very powerful, but he is not a son of the covenant. And the same thing happens to Isaac. Isaac has two boys, Jacob and Esau. Esau is not a son of the covenant. He's going to be very wealthy and very powerful in himself, but he's also going to be sort of cut off or separated from the blessing of God. And again, that theme, this idea of those in the covenant and those outside of the covenant, is going to, again, occur throughout the Bible. And is another reason why we need to study that section. And in fact, one example I'll give you very quickly is in the book of Romans. We have an extended discussion about Jacob versus Esau and how that relates to those who are saved by Jesus and those who are not saved by Jesus. But I'm going to have to explain that when we get to the book of Romans in a couple of weeks or a couple of years. All right, so the third section of the book of Genesis is called the story of Joseph. It's sometimes called the Joseph saga or the Joseph drama. I've even seen a couple of commentators who call it the Joseph novella, which is a little bit like a telenovela. And much like a telenovela, the story of Joseph at the beginning is ripe with intrigue and with sort of twists and turns and changes of fate and all sorts of things. And again, I don't want to take too much of the thunder of what we'll learn when we get to it in the Gospel Project, but Joseph starts out his life very confident and almost overly proud of his chosenness by his father Jacob. And he sees a quick downfall. In fact, the first part of the Joseph saga is that Joseph goes from being the favorite son with all of the stuff and his father's loyalty and love to literally, living in the deepest dungeon of an Egyptian prison. And that downfall then leads to sort of the upswing that we're going to see at the end or the second half of the Joseph saga. Now, during the time that Joseph is on the rise, right, he's rising in power because God has blessed him with giving him the ability to interpret dreams, the story tells us, and that gives him favor with Pharaoh and with others in Egypt. At the same time, we see sort of intermittent in there the other tribes of Israel coming back and forth. And that's why I said before that it's a little bit fuzzy where the patriarchal narrative ends and where the Joseph narrative begins, right? So in about chapter 35 of Genesis, some are going to say 36 and 37, that's where the fuzziness is, we start shifting the focus of the story from Jacob to Joseph, but also to Judah, right? And this is going to give us some glimpse into how that inheritance of the covenant is going to work in Israel. So before we had Abraham gives it to Isaac, Isaac gives it to Jacob. It's one father to one son. After Jacob, it seems that the blessing sort of diffuses across several of the tribes or sons of Jacob. Right. One option is Reuben, who's the true firstborn son, but the story tells us that like Ishmael and like Esau, the firstborn son does not get the covenant in the biblical order. So Reuben, because of his own sin, falls away. So then because of a process of events, the blessing or the leadership of Israel is going to move to Judah or to Joseph. And that's where I'm going to say there's this fuzziness, right? So Judah is the son of one wife of Jacob, that would be Leah, while Joseph is the son of the other wife, Rachel, right? And so Joseph is the firstborn son of the second wife, while Judah is the fourthborn son of the first wife. It gets very complex, and there will be a chart later, but not right now. So when we have these two sons, we see that basically the leadership of these tribes is going to sort of divide between the two of them. Joseph is going to represent one type of power structure within the tribes. He's the one that saves everybody in the Joseph narrative, because he gets to be the vizier of Pharaoh, and when the other tribes come down because of their famine, he saves everybody. Of course, he has little tricky tricks that he does to test their loyalty to him. While Judah is the leader of those who are coming down, and he represents the one who is shown to be morally upright among the remaining brothers after Joseph. In fact, when we get there to the Joseph story and we have that pivotal scene when Joseph is testing his brothers, we find that Judah stands up, and he's the one that communicates the leadership of the tribes, and he's the one that says, I will take blame and I will take responsibility for what my brothers have done. And again, that's part of that story of where you have these two leaders who are interacting with each other to reveal how the leadership is going to work. And that's basically where we leave the book of Genesis. At the end, Jacob dies, and then soon after that, Joseph dies. And we're told that the children of Israel, which are also the grandchildren of Israel by this point, are going to live in a land in Egypt, the land of Goshen. And they're very prosperous at this time, and that's where the book closes. Okay? So just to have a very quick review, and then I'm going to open it for questions. We have 3 sections in Genesis. We have the primeval or primordial history, Genesis 1 through 11, in which we see the beginning of the world order, the creation and humanity and sin. And the second unit, chapters 12 through about 35, is the patriarchal history, in which we understand that God makes covenants with his people. And in the third section, from wherever we stopped at, Genesis 35, through the end of Genesis 50, we will see the idea of the promise and the movement of Israel to this one son, one father dynamic to a group of tribes.